James Carter sat on the front porch of his small, weather-beaten house, watching the sun sink behind the pine trees that lined the edges of the road. At 70 years old, he moved slower than he used to, but his eyes still carried the sharpness of a soldier who had once walked through rice paddies in Vietnam, scanning for danger. His hands were rough, his back stiff, and his knees ached every time he stood. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the soft sound of his granddaughter's breathing from the bedroom inside. Her name was Alana, 8 years old, full of questions and laughter that could light up a room, until sickness came knocking at their door. It had started with a fever that wouldn't break, then the endless doctor visits. Finally, the diagnosis, an immune condition that required expensive medication to keep her stable. James had faced many battles in his life, but this one humbled him. No weapon, no strategy, no platoon could fight for him here. Just money. And money was the one thing he didn't have. The veteran's pension he received barely covered the bills. He picked up part-time work when he could. Odd jobs, handyman repairs, even mowing lawns for neighbors, who still looked at him with a mix of pity and suspicion. In their small southern town, people remembered who James was, the black man, who had fought for a country that didn't always fight for him. Some saluted him. Others spat on the ground when he passed. The years hadn't erased the old wounds of racism that cut deep in places like these. But James had learned to keep his head high. He'd fought for survival before. He could do it again. Still, when he opened the pill bottles on the kitchen counter and counted what was left, a cold dread crept into his chest. Alana needed another month's supply. The doctor had warned him. Missing doses could set her back in ways that medicine might not fix. James knew what that meant. He couldn't let her down. That night, he sat by her bed, watching her small chest rise and fall. Her curly hair fanned across the pillow, and her tiny hand rested over his. She stirred in her sleep, murmuring, "Grandpa, don't leave." His heart tightened. "I'm not going anywhere, baby girl," he whispered. But deep inside, he wondered how long he could keep that promise. On the far side of the garage sat something that had carried him through decades of storms. His Harley Davidson Softail, black and chrome, polished like it had just rolled off the line. He'd bought it after Vietnam, back when he needed something to outrun his memories. That bike wasn't just steel and rubber. It was freedom. It was every mile of open road he had ever ridden. Every time he'd left pain in the rearview mirror. It was also the one thing of real value he had left. James tried to push the thought away, but it came back stronger each night. The Harley could buy medicine. The Harley could buy time. The Harley could keep Alana alive. He wrestled with the idea for days, pacing the porch, rubbing his aching knees, staring at the bike like it was both salvation and betrayal. What would it say about him to give up the one thing that had carried him all these years? Would it mean the racists in town were right, that a black man like him couldn't hold on to anything he loved without having it ripped away? But then he'd hear Alana's cough, thin and sharp in the middle of the night. He'd see the way her energy drained after only a few steps. And he knew the Harley was just a machine. Alana was flesh, blood, and love. One evening, James called his old war buddy Leon, who lived 2 towns over. Leon picked up on the second ring, his deep voice steady as ever. "James, you sound tired." "I'm all right," James lied. "Listen, I need to ask you something. Do you know anyone looking to buy a Harley?" The silence on the other end was heavy. Finally, Leon spoke. "You sure you want to do that, brother? That bike's been with you longer than anything." James swallowed hard. "I'm sure. My granddaughter needs her medicine. That's all that matters." Leon sighed, a sound filled with years of shared understanding. "I'll put the word out." "But James, this ain't right. A man shouldn't have to give up his pride to keep his family alive." James chuckled bitterly. "Been a black man in this country long enough to know, right don't mean much when you're broke." They talked a little longer, but after hanging up, James sat in the quiet house, staring at the shadows creeping across the floor. His heart felt heavy, like he'd already lost something precious. That night, sleep wouldn't come. He stepped into the garage, flicked on the bare bulb overhead, and let his eyes rest on the Harley. He ran his hand along the handlebars, tracing the memories embedded in every dent and scratch. The road trips with Leon, the rallies where he was always the only black rider, but never the one to back down. The nights he rode alone just to hear the wind drown out the world. "Thank you," he whispered to the machine, as if it were an old friend. Tomorrow he'd make the call. And so, as the first light of dawn crept over the pines, James Carter, the veteran who had fought for his country, endured its scorn and still carried the scars of both, prepared to fight a different kind of battle. One that would cost him the last piece of freedom he owned. But for Alana, he would pay the price. The garage smelled faintly of oil and dust, with a hint of gasoline that never really left. No matter how many times James cracked the door, open to let the air move through, the old Harley sat there like a monument, silent and proud, its black paint gleaming under the weak light bulb. It wasn't just a bike. It was a companion, a vessel of memories, a reminder that even in his darkest days, freedom had been within reach. James leaned against the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, staring at the machine as if it might start speaking to him. His granddaughter, Alana, was still asleep inside, and the quiet morning gave him time to wrestle with his thoughts. He remembered the first time he'd laid eyes on it. It had been 1973, not long after he returned from Vietnam. He was 25, restless and angry at the world. No one welcomed him home. No parades, no applause. Some people spat at him for fighting in a war they didn't believe in. For James, it wasn't about politics. It was about surviving and protecting the men who stood beside him. One afternoon, after another long shift at the factory, James passed a dealership with rows of bikes lined up like soldiers. The Harley Softail caught his eye immediately. Sleek lines, shining chrome, a beast built for the open road. He remembered pressing his face against the glass like a boy, staring at it as if it could answer all the questions life had thrown at him. He didn't have the money then, but he saved. Every paycheck, he put something aside. A year later, he walked into that dealership and rode out with the Harley. The moment he kicked the engine to life, it felt like breathing for the first time. The roar of the pipes drowned out the silence of the nights, the nightmares of gunfire, the weight of what he'd left behind overseas. That bike carried him through everything. Long rides into the hills when he needed to clear his head, trips to biker rallies where strangers became friends around campfires, even the times when he was the only black man in a sea of leather jackets. He held his ground, shoulders squared, because the Harley gave him a seat at the table. On the road, he was just another rider. James walked closer now, running his calloused fingers along the handlebars, feeling the cool metal beneath his skin. The bike had scars, too, a dent on the left side from a slide. He took on a rain slick, rode in 82, a tiny chip on the tank where Alana, when she was just a toddler, had once tapped it with a toy hammer before he could stop her. He'd laughed then, scooping her up, telling her, "Baby girl, this here's Grandpa's treasure. You don't go banging on treasure." His laugh now was quieter, tinged with sorrow. The Harley had been the one thing that stayed when everything else slipped through his fingers. Jobs came and went. Friends drifted away. His wife left years ago, tired of living with a man haunted by war and hardened by poverty. But the bike was always there, waiting for him. Selling it felt like selling a piece of himself. He pulled a rag from the workbench and started wiping the chrome, though it didn't need it. His reflection stared back at him, aged, lines carved deep into his face, eyes that had seen too much. He remembered the words his commanding officer once told him. In Vietnam, you fight for the man next to you, not for the flag. That's what makes it worth it. James swallowed hard. Now the man next to him was an 8-year-old girl with wide brown eyes and a laugh that melted his heart. He'd fight for her, even if it meant losing the last piece of himself. Later that afternoon, Leon showed up. The two old soldiers embraced briefly before Leon stepped into the garage, his gaze falling on the Harley. "Still looks damn good," Leon said, whistling low. "Been keeping her clean. Didn't think I'd be talking about letting her go." Leon shook his head. "Hurts me just to hear it, but I spread the word. A guy named Mitchell out in Greenville's interested. He's got the cash." James stiffened. Greenville was one of those towns where a black man didn't walk alone after dark. "Mitchell, what's he like?" Leon's expression told James what he already feared. "He's one of them types. Old money, thinks the world belongs to him, but he pays fair." James rubbed his temples. He didn't need fair. He needed enough. And if Mitchell was willing, then pride had no place in the matter.